Hello and welcome to Eighth House Portal. Welcome to this episode where I will be continuing the discussion of releasing the old self. We will concentrate today on the first stage of alchemy, Nigredo. And in this way, I feel like it will help us understand a bit more about releasing the old self. In the previous episode, I think I spoke about the ego, archetypes, the shadow, the conscious and unconscious parts of ourselves. And a lot of times you'll hear me referencing work from Carl Jung. Actually, I've kind of put off looking into Carl Jung for quite some time, and I think it was just due to seeing and hearing so many people throwing quotes out all the time from his work. But I'm not sure if they were used in the correct way. You know, it's like a single line can sound profound that you share, yet it means something very different when you live with it for years. So like, what does it look like when it's actually embodied? So I'm not sure. I kind of got put off looking further into his work. But when you go through things like alchemy or, the old self, you're forced to look at his work because he's done so much. And I'll also mention people like Steiner quite a bit. And I encourage anyone to do your own research, like I've said before. Look into who these people are. I might even do like a biography episode just to get an understanding about who are these people we're getting all this knowledge from, right? So because the discussion will be about the first stage of alchemy, let's kind of discuss certain terms. Sometimes we'll hear terms like emergence of the self or rubedo or calcination, etc. What do they all mean? Are they related? Are they from different sources? Like, what is it all about? So I just would like to kind of clarify that. So there's different layers. Okay. We have, I guess, classical stages of alchemy. So, and this is coming from Greco-Egyptian, Islamic, and medieval European alchemy, and it's describing transformation of matter using symbolic color changes. So you have 4 stages of alchemy: Nigredo, Albedo, Citrinitas, and Rubedo. So, I mean, you can just use your common sense. What color would Nigredo be? It would be black. What about Albedo? Right, albinism. It would be white. Citrinitas, that would be yellow or gold. And then Rubedo would be red. And then you've got the 7 alchemical operations. They are the methods. They're not linear stages, and they can occur multiple times within each of those color stages of alchemy. So within those alchemical operations, you have calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction, fermentation, distillation, and coagulation. So you've got like 3 stages. You've got the colors, right? The stages of alchemy. So that's like where you are. And then you've got the operations within that. So what is happening? And then we can look at the psychological meaning and use Jungian psychology. How does it feel internally? So when we look at Carl Jung and what he's shared, he has shadow confrontation, so that being ego collapse. Then you've got soul image encounter, so emotional truths you're experiencing. And then there's a growing consciousness, so there's an inner authority that you experience. And then emergence of the self, so that experience would be integration. I want to look at all these layers so that we can kind of clarify and have a deeper understanding of how this all works in the real world. Alchemy doesn't assume everyone is in a stage, because not everyone is doing the work, opus. You can live entirely outside of the alchemical process. You have to remember the unconscious doesn't transform the ego until it is acknowledged. Individuation cannot begin where there's no self-reflection. Last time, I know, actually a few times now, I think I've shared some story creations, and it seems like that might be something that I just do. I want to share another story creation, just to kind of put it in a perspective of where we are in this time. This is called Edmund. Edmund had not planned to stop. He was meant to keep walking, past the cafe with the plant-based menu written in chalk, past the screens glowing blue in the early dark, past the people with headphones sealed tight over their ears as if something inside them was leaking. But his body slowed anyway. The phone in his hand buzzed again. Another alert, another update, another reminder that the world was moving forward. Markets shifting, AI replacing another department, a friend announcing a pregnancy, someone else leaving the country to start fresh. Edmund stared at the glass of a closed storefront and caught his reflection. Older than he remembered. Fatter somehow. Not sad, just reduced. He used to know who he was. That thought landed without drama. Just a quiet observation. The job title he'd worked towards for a decade now was under review. The relationship he'd kept alive through compromise had gone strangely silent. No fights, no closure, just absence. Even his opinions felt borrowed now, recycled from headlines and conversations he no longer trusted. Something inside him burned. Not anger, not grief, but exposure. As if a fire had been lit beneath his feet, and the things he'd built his life on were combusting without asking permission. He thought of the way he used to speak with certainty, the way he used to correct people, the way he believed effort alone could secure meaning. That voice was gone. What remained was ash. Days passed like this. He went to work. He answered emails. He smiled when required. But inside, structure softened. Sleep became thin and strange. Dreams bled into waking hours. Old memories surfaced without context. Conversations, choices, versions of himself he hadn't thought about in years. One evening, alone in his apartment, Edmund stood at the sink, holding a glass he hadn't realized was shaking. Tears came. Not from a story, not from pain he could name, but from a loss of edges. He could no longer tell where he ended and the world began. Time felt liquid. Identity felt negotiable. Nothing solidified long enough to grip. He sat on the floor and let it happen. No affirmations, no fixing, no meaning-making. Just the quiet recognition. Whatever I was before cannot come with me. Edmund is not broken. He is in Nigredo, the blackening. The fire that burned his false certainties was calcination. The unraveling that followed the loss of form and boundary is dissolution. This is not the end of the story, but it is the end of who he thought he was. So as we try to understand this alchemical process, the first stage of being Nigredo, the blackening, well, what does that mean? Death, putrefaction, ego dissolution. What do I mean by putrefaction? Some of you may have heard that term. It's the fifth stage of death, decomposition of organic matter. And that results in a foul odor. And there's a gas that's released and liquefaction. So if anyone's studied forensic science or works in the field, you know what that looks like, probably what it smells like if you work in the field. It's a stage of death that is marked by bloating, discoloration. I remember when I lived in Thunder Bay, when I was going to university, I was in one of my practical placements, and I was working with another nurse. She was my mentor, and it was home care nursing that we did, and we went into this apartment building. We had to go up, I think it was the fifth or maybe sixth floor. We had to go up to somebody's flat, and when you get to the main ground, when you walked into the building that day, I remember an odor I had never smelled before, and went into the lift. We went up to the sixth floor, and as we ascended, the odor became more intense, and we were both so quiet. It was an unusual silence, actually. And I remember I just had to say something. I turned and said to her, "Is that smell a dead body?" Now, I don't know, I didn't know prior to that what a decaying body smelled like, but that's just what came to my mind. And she tried to be very calm and said, no, they're probably just cleaning something, And I said, are you sure? I mean, I have a feeling that's like the smell of a decaying body somewhere in this building. And you could also smell like, obviously the body had been found in the building, and you could smell like a layer of bleach that they probably tried to use to clean up whatever, mess was left. And you have to remember, because it was the middle of winter, and Thunder Bay can get really cold, but it was the middle of winter, and of course in an apartment building, you're in a flat and you put the heating on, that decay is going to become faster, right? You're going to speed up the process of decay. So, they may not have been there too long, but you never forget that smell once you smell it. It's intense. In any case, so putrefaction, right? If we go back to Nigredo, where does it live in this process of releasing the old self? It puts you through, it's the first point. It's the point of no return, is how I see it. It's that collapse of persona, the failure of all those ego strategies you once had. You have to remember, matter has to rot before it can transform. And so releasing the old self does not happen before Nigredo. It happens because of Nigredo. What comes to mind is it's a painting by Francisco Goya. And he has a painting called Saturn Devouring His Sun. Francisco Goya was a royal court painter for the Spanish royal family. And he had painted quite pleasing images for them. He went from painting beautiful images to painting the poor, the sick, the mad. He was born in Spain in 1747. His father was a gilder who worked on decorating a cathedral in Saragossa. and his mother apparently was of minor nobility. He became an apprentice at 13 to a painter, Jose Luzon. I believe he applied for scholarship to the Royal Academy of Art when he was 17. He was unsuccessful, and I believe he applied again a few more times. He traveled to Italy when he was a bit older, in his 20s, with a troupe of bullfighters, and apparently fell in love with a nun. He made a friend, I believe, Francisco Bayou, and he eventually married his friend's sister, and they had multiple children. Unfortunately, I think it was like 8 children, but only one son survived, unfortunately. And then he became gravely ill when he was a bit older. So 1777, he became very ill. And most of his work at that point were depictions of religious or aristocratic subjects. So they were very pleasing to the eye and definitely would impress wealthy families. In 1779, there was a bit of a twist, a turn. He started taking an interest in the dark side of Spanish society, and I believe he painted a man that was executed by strangulation. And it's a very dark painting if you look it up. He ended up later on becoming a painter for King Charles III and painted royal families. He became very seriously ill again. So this was a pattern that was happening in his life. He became very ill again, stomach pains, headaches, tinnitus. I believe he lost eyesight. He lost the use of his right arm. There was weight loss, hallucinations. I believe he was sick for over a year, but he did eventually regain eyesight and use of his arm, but he remained completely deaf. Then he also experienced the war in Spain, the Napoleonic Wars. There was famine from 1811 to 1812. He became seriously ill again. And for those 3 years, I believe he stayed in his home. And that's where he painted what we call the black pictures. He painted those on the walls in his home. They were oil paintings on plaster. And one of those paintings is Saturn devouring his sons. And you can just look at that painting yourself, look it up, and see how deeply depressed, that came through his work. If you look at Saturn devouring his son, there was an earlier painting of the same thing by Peter Paul Rubens from 1636. But Goya's version is even darker than that, I think. It contains a madness, which I'm assuming is an expression of his own feelings of turning mad due to his illness. And you have to remember, Saturn is the planetary ruler of Nigredo. Remember, Nigredo is the first stage of the great work, right? There's the putrefaction, the decay, the blackness, the psychological despair. There's a death of the old identity. With Saturn, there's a coldness, a melancholy, the control of time. In Nigredo, there's this decay, the aging, the inevitability, the despair, the ego death. Think about the illness Goya was living with, whether it was the bubonic plague or yellow fever, the pain and suffering of months or years of that. All that despair or inevitability spilling out into his work. What he was experiencing was what he painted. Well, that's what I think anyway. For him, it was most likely an impending doom, not just an internal transformation, but for him, unfortunately, a literal death knocking at his door. We can look at this painting in terms of Nigredo with Saturn, like that large, giant, animalistic figure, or Kronos, devouring his children, so that he's not overthrown. He's trying to freeze time to stop the inevitable. So the kind of look at it as the older order consuming the new potentials. The fear of preventing. There's a fear, so he's trying to prevent transformation. You can see it as like the ego trying to maintain dominance. And Saturn can represent ego structures. And the child he's devouring in the painting would be the future identity or the emerging self. So eating his children would be the resistance or the denial. You can look at that painting, you can see the panic in his facial expression or the madness, right? The child he's devouring, to me, looks more like a female figure. I don't know, what do you guys think? I guess it's subjective, but let me know what you think. It looks more like a female figure to me. Or you could see it as the anima, right? Like it's what I spoke about last time. Maybe that's why the child looks like a female. It actually looks like an adult, not like an actual kid. But you can have adult children, right? So the child he's devouring looks like a female. Maybe it's his own soul. You know, share your thoughts on that. Maybe it's just meant to be androgynous. I don't know. And then you see the black background of the painting, literally Nigredo, right? There's that madness, the cannibalism, the destruction, no redemption visible. There's a point that one must confront. You have to decide what cannot continue, right? So if we look at the alchemical operations that belong to Nigredo, so we have the stages, right? We're in Nigredo. Now look at the other layer. Look at the operations, the alchemical operations that go within the stages. The first operation being calcination. So what is calcination? In classical alchemy, calcination is a preparatory process where the material or the matter is subject to intense heat until it's reduced to ashes or powdery substance. The term comes from the Latin, I think it's calcinare, meaning to burn lime. It involves intense heat to break down a substance to ash. And it's used in actual physical alchemy, like to purify materials by removing volatile components. So base material is brought to its most fundamental state. And that fixed state of identity of the substance it's broken down. There's this radical simplification. I don't know if any of you have heard of this. So that which resists the fire is the seed. That's like a quote from early alchemical commentary, meaning whatever resists the fire is the true essence of a substance which further transformation can grow from. And you have to remember that fire is extremely important and must come first. It's essential in calcination. In a lab, it's an actual fire, right? So external heat. Then there's a philosophical fire. That would be the inner burning. That inner burning that cannot be quenched any longer. Fire is the only thing that can reduce a substance to its most basic, irreducible state. So what burns away will be impurity, excess, instability. And what remains, like I said, is the seed. So what is left when all the unnecessary is removed is the substance, that foundation for the next operation. So the fire represents the intensity, the pressure, exposure, the inescapable. So how do we relate this to life? In life, we see it as maybe a fire to our identity. So, for example, maybe you had a career that defined you, and suddenly you're laid off. Or you've had a long-held role, like you're a provider or a caretaker, and then it just becomes impossible. What do I mean by it becomes impossible? For example, let's say you're a father and a husband, and unfortunately, you experienced a stroke. Now you're in hospital, you can't move, can't walk, you can't even eat on your own. Now you're unable to go to work and provide for your family. Okay, there's no turning back from that. What survives after the fire is the person underneath that role. The calcination destroys the possibility of return. Then there's, I guess, relational fire. So attachment structures are incinerated. For example, if you get a divorce, that can permanently alter your self-concept. Maybe there was betrayal. So emotional coping strategies will fail. Your self-image is exposed as maybe a false or incomplete. You don't feel the same. You don't know where you belong. So in calcination, the attachments burn. The fantasy burns. The idea of who you were in that relationship burns. In the end, there becomes this raw self-awareness. Or you could have the fire being an existential fire. So maybe you have loss of religious belief without any replacement. Maybe you realize that success doesn't equal fulfillment, or that doing the right thing all the time is somehow it still fails. So trying to distract yourself will fail. Depression or emptiness begins to emerge. Maybe you've got body fire, so an illness that cannot be bypassed by mindset. I do this a lot, I'll be honest. More so when I was younger and into sports and competing, I would always remind myself about mind over matter and that pain didn't mean anything. And I became really good at blocking most physical pain, actually, and continuing whatever I was doing, whatever practice or competition I was in. I would feel it a bit more later on in the day or the next day, but there comes a point where that doesn't work. Also, depending on the type of injury you have, right? So if you break your wrist, if you break a bone of any sort, you will not be able to continue. Okay, that's just a fact. Aging is another thing that could affect you, or hormonal or neurological changes. Within that, your pride is destroyed, and that illusion of mastery is annihilated. And then there's time fire. So Saturn is the timekeeper. Examples of this could be, maybe you missed a window. Maybe you were always hoping to conceive, to have children, and you were always putting it off, trying to make everything perfect. And then all of a sudden you realize that opportunity is gone. Well, we do live in a day and age where we can still have children. I guess you can adopt a child in vitro, etc. But the way you imagined it is, at some point it won't be likely that you're going to do it that way if you waste the time. Or maybe you realize avoidance has accumulated at a cost. Let me try to think of an example. Maybe there was that one person that you always wanted to go out with, to take out, to speak to get to know more. And you kept missing out on every opportunity. Maybe you were too shy, too scared. So it would be like you've wasted so much time thinking about whether you should make a move or not. And then eventually somebody else steps in and does what you should have done, and it's too late. Now they're gone. Then you have a social fire. So this would be more relevant, I guess, to our time now, where so many people have YouTube channels, podcasts, etc. So like, for example, trying to create an online presence, but you're invisible. There's like a loss of validation. Or maybe you are no longer chosen by the system or the algorithms, and you fall. Or another thing could be you have a viewpoint, a perspective that not many people agree with, and so you fall out of that culture desirability. All that fire will burn away your performance, your persona. Just remember, calcination fire is not like the everyday stress we experience, okay? Or being busy or overwhelmed. even emotional pain. You can have emotional pain, but your identity is still intact. Calcination fire is that pressure that destroys a false structure, and it does not allow it to be rebuilt. So the surviving, that remaining matter is much more simple. It's quiet, it's more honest, less impressive. When we look at Carl Jung's process, what would fall in Nigredo would be the shadow confrontation. In Boundaries of the Soul by June Singer, there is a section on individuation, and it states, only in the analysis when he began to confront the unconscious could he learn that it was his own feeling of being garbage, worthless, that he was projecting upon the world. I found that interesting, of course. You see the patient that she's speaking of here. There's a breakdown of the ego boundary. The patient could not tolerate feeling worthless any longer. That feeling had to be placed outside of himself. So he was projecting to the world. So the world became garbage, hostile, and meaningless. So that boundary between the conscious and the unconscious weakens. The projection collapses. That shadow is then carried by the ego. Then commencing comes depression, shame that follows that ego humiliation. This is confronting the shadow. There's the emotional pain of meeting what the ego denied. The ego defenses are down. It's overwhelmed. This is the moment the ego realizes it is no longer in charge. What is left, when all the unnecessary is removed, is the substance, that foundation for the next operation. So I listen to music a lot. It helps me with certain aspects of my life, I guess. There's a song, there's a composition by Tchaikovsky. I love Tchaikovsky. I guess it's the ballet, but Symphony No. 6, Pathétique, the final movement. If you listen to Symphony No. 6, it reminds me of Nigredo. You can hear like a descent. The movement is like descending, and there's like a tension that you can feel. If you had to, I guess, hear it as in a form of music, that would be a piece that I would say lives in Nigredo. And then the more, not well known, but one of my favorite bands, His Infernal Majesty. One of my favorite songs, actually, Soul on Fire. I love listening to that. It definitely feels like it would be Nigredo. When you hear that song, I feel like I'm falling, and then I wake up in Hades, and there's this violent realization of the darkness you're surrounded by. And then there's another song by the same band, Killing Loneliness. That song was apparently inspired. So Villevalo wrote that song. He said he was inspired by the skateboarder Brandon Novak, I believe, in regards to his heroin addiction. I mean, he was addicted to not just heroin, but I think that was the main issue. And his heroin addiction was an attempt to kill loneliness. So he was trying to escape the condition, attempt to suppress that internal pain, numb the emotional wounds. I would definitely say that's a part of Nigredo. That would be not dealing with what's trying to come out, kind of like the painting by Goya, right? Trying to suppress. what's meant to continue forward in the future. There are certain artists whose work seems to arrive not just as music, but as recognition. Much of, I think, what Vida Valo writes has met me in that way, not as something I consume, but more as something I encounter, whether it's the melody, the lyrics, the mythological undertones he has, or that persistent tension between darkness and beauty, good and evil. His music seems to reach inward rather than outward, and at times it feels uncannily familiar, as though the music articulates an inner register I might otherwise struggle to express. Kind of resembles that in emotional timber I imagine my own inner world would take if it had sound. If I were translated into music rather than language, it might live somewhere in that same contrast where longing, restraint, melancholy, beauty coexist with it without needing to resolve one another. And what strikes me most often is these songs have found me precisely where I am in life. Not ahead of me, not offering a resolution, but just alongside, articulating something I may not have been able to name. And there's no attempt to deny pain or to resolve sadness prematurely. Instead, the music, it allows it to exist, to be played out, or to be held. In that sense, there's a quiet kind of healing at work, I think. Not like the healing of erasure, but of acknowledgement, a recognition that beauty and sorrow are not opposites, but maybe companions, and that allowing space for both can in itself be a form of meaning. So calcination does not build, it prepares you for the next operation, being dissolution. I think many people fail that work because they try to heal before being reduced. They seek meaning before surrender. They try to bypass the fire and go straight for integration, which you cannot do. I kind of, over December, kind of looked into astrology just a tad. I was very curious about Saturn conjuncting the sun, if that were something you had in your chart. So if you have, and this is what I'll share with you, it's just kind of like a personal thing I looked into. But if you have Saturn conjunct your natal sun in the 8th house, it is considered, apparently, true calcination. Isn't that interesting? So I'd say calcination breaks the ego structure, bringing it to dissolution, which is the next operation meant to expose what was holding that structure together. If you visualize it as a structure of a building, and the walls and maybe even the flooring have been burned by a fire, the fire is extinguished and you have ash, but also now you see that things that were hidden deep in the flooring or the ground that you wouldn't be able to know even existed if the fire didn't occur. That's how I see it anyway. Dissolution, or water, reveals the content. So what you're holding inside can no longer stay contained. Because through calcination, the defenses are weakened, right? The walls are down. And trying to control things doesn't work anymore. So this next operation, dissolution, would be the emotional and psychological flooding that follows. When you take a burned substance and you immerse it in liquid, it becomes fluid, right? Kind of homogeneous, and boundaries are dissolved. There's a loss of structure. This is observable if you remember any chemistry, right? So in psychological terms, you could relate something related to our topic, right? One will experience maybe emotional overwhelm, possibly depression, anxiety, regression, maybe just feeling lost. At this point, the ego isn't able to suppress unconscious material. This may be a point where people say things like, I don't know who I am anymore. Or maybe you feel like everything is just coming up all at once. So calcination reveals what's underneath or hidden. This is the part where we experience, I guess, being disoriented. You can feel like you're very disoriented. But keep in mind, dissolution is not a weakness or a failure. It's not a regression into childhood. It's not losing one's mind. And it is not permanent. Calcination will break down the walls, and dissolution is when the water rushes in and you aren't able to hold it together. Maybe you realize at this point how much you were holding. I just had an image, I don't know, pop into my mind. Like if you were in a deep sea vessel and there's a leak, so now water is rushing in and there's nothing you can do, right? There's pressure all around that vessel. Maybe you want to try to get out, but even if you do get out, you know all the while you have a long way to go up and get air, right? That's kind of how I imagined it. Like that image just popped into my head. From The Boundaries of the Soul by June Singer. She mentions the dissolution of the person is a dangerous but necessary process. So Jung warns repeatedly that when the persona dissolves, the psyche, so the unconscious, conscious, everything that makes up our inner world, the psyche enters a dangerous but necessary place. Not enlightenment, but a disorientation. I know Rudolf Steiner mentions how one must endure a condition of inner chaos. Just referring to like where ordinary structures collapse, then producing fear, a chaos. Nigredo isn't something mystical that happens outside life. It happens inside it. So when calcination burns away what no longer holds, dissolution can begin, right? That second operation, the alchemical operations, right? Dissolution begins not as insight, but as a feeling. Things soften. Certainty will fade. Emotions rise that were never given time to be felt. And this isn't failure, and it's not regression. It is the psyche becoming fluid enough to change. And alchemy reminds us that nothing new is born from what stays fixed. If you find yourself here, unsettled, emotional, uncertain, it does not mean something has gone wrong. It may mean that the work has finally begun. Dissolution is not meant to be rushed, okay? It's not meant to be fixed or pushed through. You have to hold the vessel. Let the process unfold without trying to escape it or define it too quickly. I don't know, for whatever reason, I get a flashback of the first Matrix movie. I don't know if anyone's watched that. I think most people have watched that, right? The scene where Neo has taken the red pill already, offered by Morpheus, and he looks into a mirror and he touches the mirror, and the mirror liquefies and attaches to him. And then it starts moving up his arm and it takes over his whole body. That's just the image that kind of flashed in my mind right now. I guess if we look at that movie, so like before the mirror scene, Neo certainty about reality is already broken. His identity is destabilized. And he chooses truth, right? He chooses the truth. He chooses the red pill. That was the choice of calcination, so burning away the old structure, the collapse of the ego world. And even before this, if you remember, we see how Neo is just going through life and following the steps of what he's supposed to do, right? He's just going through the movements, but he can feel something is different. And while we watch, I think we feel it, right? You can feel it too when you're watching the movie, the lighting, that dreary look, the kind of a darkness to it, shadows, right? It reminds us that many of us felt that, I think. Like there has to be something more than just this. Then, of course, an opportunity knocks and he follows the white rabbit. His world opens up. I guess the mirror would be his ego boundary, that self-image. It becomes liquid, right? The boundary between self and the world dissolves. He becomes a liquid, and so it's liquid metal, right? And just remember, Neo doesn't shatter the mirror, it melts. And it was uncontrollable, it was overwhelming, and it was unstoppable. There's a fear and a panic as it takes over, and we kind of go through that with him. I think that's what I did the first time I watched it. The dissolution doesn't feel calm or empowering while it's happening, does it? We get an illustration of what dissolution feels like, I think, from that scene. Alchemy doesn't ask us to arrive anywhere quickly. But sometimes the work is simply just to notice what is dissolving and to stay present long enough to let it move. If things feel unclear, fluid, or unsettled, you are not broken. You may simply be in the waters of change. Until next time, take care.